In this video, I'm going to talk about issues related to experimental validity. So when you design an experiment, the idea is you want to isolate out the effect of a particular IV that you hypothesize can cause an effect to a DV. Reasons for an experiment failing, meaning your IV not having the effect you anticipated, could include that the IV and the DV are unrelated. But it also might be the case that there are ways in which your standards of internal validity have failed. Now, on the other hand, and equally as problematic, or maybe more problematic, sometimes finding an effect of your independent variable on your dependent variable is also the result of a failure to maintain the standards of rigorous internal validity. Basically, you want the results of your experiment to reflect real effects. You don't want it to reflect other sorts of effects that you didn't anticipate. So creating a really well-designed experiment takes a lot more thoughtfulness and effort to reduce the effect of these external confounds. So I'm going to talk about all these potential pitfalls throughout this video. So in classical theorizing on good experimental design, Shadish, Cook, and Campbell outlined a series of what we call classical threats to experimental validity. These are the basic sort of pitfalls of design that we want to avoid in order to make sure that the results of our experiment are rigorously tested and any effects reflect the true effect of the independent variable. So things like not trusting anecdotes or testimonials, failure to have a baseline control group, these are the really basic failures of maintaining internal validity that we definitely want to seek to avoid. So this is meant to encompass all things that could lead to changes in the experimental group instead of the actual core independent variable that you're trying to change. So the basic idea is, over the course of the experiment, you're hoping for that experimental group to see changes that you would predict. If you see those changes, but not for the actual reason that you were trying to manipulate, your experiment really fails to do what it's meant to do. So the 6 classic threats that these authors outlined are the 6 I've listed here. So I'm going to go through and discuss them a little bit. These are the sort of core classical ones that we talk about. There are further ones that have been outlined in subsequent theorizing that I'll get into later, but this is the sort of classic list. One threat to experimental validity is something that you can't necessarily change, but you need to take into account. So history. Basically, what is going on in the world and society around us. If something changes in your experimental group because of external sort of societal influences, you can't necessarily change that, but you need to take that into account. Let's say, for example, you're doing an experiment here in 2020, the year of our Lord, and you started it in January. January was a very, very different time than we're living through now in summer of 2020. If you're seeing changes to your experimental group between January and now, and you say that it's due to your experimental influence, you have to say to yourself, no, history is changing around us. We're living through a pandemic that only started within the sort of course of time of 2020. It sort of started to become a factor more so in February. It became more and more of an issue in March when lockdowns started. If you're doing an ongoing experiment here in 2020, as historical circumstances are changing so frequently, you need to take that into account. Again, you can't change history, but you need to make sure to at least account for it. So any changes in your experimental group over the course of time where historical factors may be changing, you need to take into account that that might be affecting what your study group is going through. Maturation, this is how the participants in your experiment may just change naturally over time. Developmental stages change throughout the course of our lifespan. So if you're doing an experiment that spans over multiple developmental stages in your participant's life, and you're seeing changes in your experimental group, you can't necessarily attribute that directly to your experimental influence. You need to take into account that people change over the course of their lifetime. Again, you can't change this. You can't slow the rate of maturation, but you need to take it into account. Given that changes for the natural course of maturation are always possibly an explanation for the way your experimental group changes over time, doesn't mean that you need to eliminate that influence. You just need to take it into account. Regression to the mean is an interesting one, and it's very much a statistical concept. Regression to the mean is a phenomenon whereby any sorts of extreme scores in really any context tend to be followed up by a regression to the mean, meaning that if you see an extreme score that's just one of those fluky coincidental things, you can't necessarily expect that to be an ongoing trend. Regression to the mean indicates that any sort of fluky extreme score, you'll see a sort of a boomerang effect where you might see an extreme score in the opposite direction, and you're going to naturally see scores center around their mean. So a way to conceptualize this that will make sense to any of you who have ever played fantasy football, this is technically going on YouTube, so excuse my YouTube parlance, but comment down below. Do any of you play fantasy football, or is this going to go over everyone's heads? Any one of you who have played any sort of fantasy sports game, including fantasy football, might be familiar with a really tempting phenomenon whereby you've got a sort of a garbage player who's just taking up room on your bench. Maybe like 6 years ago when I had Chris Ivory taking up room on my bench. One week, you've got this guy sitting out a game, and all of a sudden he blows up with 30 points. And you're like, oh my God, Chris Ivory is a breakout player. I gotta start him next week. Oh, and next week what happens? He gets you negative points and you played yourself. Regression to the mean is a phenomenon whereby you can pretty reliably expect people to return to their own personal average. So this can be really hard to account for because when in an experiment are extreme or changing scores the result of legitimate change? And when are extreme scores just people having that rare fluky outcome? It can be really hard to predict which one is which, particularly if you're studying improvements over the course of therapy. A lot of the times, if you see patients in a therapeutic group improve really rapidly and you think that it bodes well for the efficacy of your treatment, you might just be seeing that extreme score and you're actually going to see a lot of backsliding in terms of improvement among therapy. So in the development of new therapies, it's always really important to continue the experiment for enough time that you know when there is genuine improvement and when an extreme score is just a fluke. Testing is when there's changes in the experimental group because they have been subjected to repeated testing and they're becoming more and more familiar with the paradigm they're experiencing. So if you're doing, let's say, a training paradigm and you're trying to improve people's memory with like a cognitive task and you test them over and over at the same outcome task and you say, wow, people improved over time the more they took my practice, my training. People will naturally improve on a task the more often they take it. So if you're trying to improve with a particular intervention, somebody's performance on a task, you need to take into account that participants are naturally going to get better at the task over time, not due to your training specifically, but just due to the fact that they're more familiar with the outcome that they're being tested on. Any changes to instrumentation? So this more so would have to do with the actual machinery that you may be using. In the context of psychology, maybe you're using a brain scanner and the machine just wears down over time, and any changes you see in your experimental group is just due to the machine becoming slower. If you're talking a slightly less advanced psychology study, let's say you're just having participants take surveys on a computer. If you're using the same computers over the course of a long period of time, and the computers just slow down and don't work as well over time, you might see changes to participants' performance just because in the beginning they were using a faster computer versus a slower computer. So any changes to the instrumentation itself, you need to take into account that that might change the way your experimental group presents results. Attrition is basically when participants drop out of a study or fail to complete measures in a study, which at this point, anyone in this class who has done their data analysis is likely highly familiar with the fact that participants don't always like to complete an entire study. If people are dropping out completely randomly, that's fine. But you have to ask yourself if there's a reason people might be dropping out of your survey. Is there something non-random about the people who opt not to take your survey? Let's say you're interested in a study on alcohol use and some outcome, and everyone who's dropping out of your survey is doing so because they're an alcoholic and they don't want to talk about that. And any interpretations or findings in your survey is only done on people who don't drink that much, well, that's going to result in a non-random sample, and you might not like that. It might limit the generalizability of your survey. So any particular reason people might be dropping out of your survey, also known as missing not at random, you need to take into account that that attrition rate might impact who ends up participating in your survey. Is there any particular reason why people stop taking your survey? Is your survey particularly stressful to certain participants, anxiety-prone participants? Are there certain people who are more likely to pass away over the course of your survey, and for that reason, they particularly aren't showing up, obviously? Any of these attrition factors, again, you can't keep people forcibly in your survey, but you want to be able to take into account whether there might be individual characteristics that are non-randomly causing certain people to fail to complete your survey or drop out entirely. So those are your classical threats, really things that, for the most part, you kind of can't control, but you need to take into account. You need to do your best to understand if any of those classical threats may be at play. And if you can't control them, at least understand their influence and identify them and at least admit that they might be impactful. Now I'm going to talk about some more modern threats that have been identified and the ways that we seek to handle them. Other threats to validity are going to include any number of selection effects. So this is basically going to be a failure of random assignment. So if there's any unique biased way that people are being assigned to the control group or the experimental group, you have what's called a selection effect. So as I covered in the simple experiments lecture, you want to make sure that every single participant who's part of your study has an equal chance of being in one condition or the other. If there are selection effects, you can never rule out that your non-random assignment criteria is responsible for any effects you find down the line. So the solution to selection effects is just to do your best to make sure that there is total random assignment. A design confound is going to be something that you, the researcher, goof up on, a mistake that you make, where you accidentally make it that the experimental group and the control group are different for a reason that you should have been able to anticipate. So let's say you have one research assistant who's covering all of the participants' data collection from the experimental group and a separate RA who was in charge of collecting data from the control group. Any differences between the experimental and control group, you can't rule out that it was the effect of the different research assistants. The easy solution to a basic goof up like that is just to make sure that you keep the experimental and control groups as similar as possible. Have one RA collect the data from both groups. It's as easy as that. But these are the little things that if you're not versed in experimental design, it might be easy to overlook. But design confounds is going to be any sort of a way that you accidentally, in the course of designing your experiment, create non-equivalency between your two groups. Order effect is going to be in any repeated measures design when you see an effect over the course of time, where the effect of the IV is confounded by the fact that participants have taken many different conditions. So recall that a repeated measures design is when all your participants are exposed to all levels of your independent variable. So let's say you see a decrease in performance in the second condition of your independent variable, and you say, look, people did poorly in the second condition. Well, you can't neglect that people just get tired the longer they're in a survey. They become fatigued, they might be getting drowsy, they might be getting lazy. If you see changes over the course of a repeated measures design, You might have what's called order effects. Now, it's pretty easy to account for order effects. You can counterbalance by having participants randomly see the order of the levels of the IV, or you can switch to a between subjects effect, where participants either see one condition or the other. So if you're concerned about practice or fatigue effects, you just need to make sure that you account for the potential order effects in your survey. A placebo effect, so this is something that likely most of you are familiar with, and if you have heard this term, it definitely comes from theorizing on potential failures of experimental designs. A placebo effect is any time an experimental group may differ from a control group because of their expectancy or their expectation that they are going to differ. So if someone in the experimental group knows that they're receiving treatment and the control group knows that they're not, just the belief among those in the experimental group receiving treatment might itself cause any improvement. The mere fact of knowing that you're receiving treatment might, in fact, make people have improvements, just knowing that you're receiving that treatment. Definitely, expectations can inform reality. So, in order to avoid this, you need to make sure that you're creating all of the equivalence between the experimental and control group that you can. If the concern is that the expectation by merely receiving a treatment is what's causing the improvement, you need to make sure that both the experimental and the control group believe they are receiving treatment. So herein comes the term placebo. You need to give the control group something that leads them to believe they are receiving treatment, creating the equivalency between the two groups, but they're not going to be receiving the active treatment that the experimental control is. So all of the participants across both conditions take a treatment, they receive a medication, they attend a therapy session, but the crucial difference between the groups is only in what sort of a treatment they receive. So both groups believe they are receiving treatment, but only the experimental group is receiving the active one that you're trying to assess. All of this is to try and avoid the so-called placebo effect. In the context of psychology, we don't use quote unquote placebos because, for the most part, we're not actually using medication. Obviously, there's psychology research on psychoactive medications, but for the most part, if we're talking psychology, we're talking about surveys that are not necessarily going to be administering actual medication. The correlate to a placebo group in psychology research is typically what we refer to as a control condition. So the control condition is your baseline condition. They're participants who receive some sort of a condition that's meant to assess a baseline level of the DV. The experimental group or the experimental condition is what's going to be compared to the control. So for all of you guys in your surveys, you were interested in a specific independent variable, and I had you guys creating two conditions. One was your experimental condition, where participants were thinking about social media or thinking about a time when they felt high self-esteem. There was always an equivalent control condition where participants were completing a similar task, but they weren't necessarily doing the same task as the experimental group. This is meant to isolate out the effect of the specific factor of the IV that you're hoping can cause an effect to the DV. So all well-designed psychology experiments, you're going to see at least two conditions, an experimental condition and a control condition that the experimental group will be compared to. Observer effects are any manner of effects in the experimental group that differ because of the effect of the experimenter observing what's going on and their expectancies, their expectations, changing the way they interpret the data. So if your research assistants or the experimenter is collecting data where they sort of know what they're looking for, this can not necessarily deliberately or consciously impact how they interpret and record the data. They may be interacting with the groups differently. They may be treating the experimental group a little bit differently. If the research assistant knows which group is getting the treatment, they may, in a very subtle way, and again, potentially not deliberately, treating the experimental group a little bit differently in a way that may be ultimately able to elicit that improvement that the researchers were hoping to see. So you obviously don't want that. The easy workaround for an observer effect is don't tell the research assistant which group is which. If you don't want the research assistant's expectations to impact how they record the data, just make sure that they're blind to which group is which. A fun historical example indicating how powerful observer effects can be is the interesting story of Clever Hans. Clever Hans was a German horse in, gosh, I don't know, the late 1800s? I don't know. Basically, the dude who owned Clever Hans basically took this horse around as a sideshow, saying that this horse could do math problems. Basically, he would put a math problem up in front of his horse, and he would tell the horse to tap out the number that would indicate the answer of a math problem. He found that Clever Hans was able to get these math problems correct based on the way he trained him almost all the time. He took this horse around, and everyone was amazed that this horse could do math problems. Here's the problem. Hans was doing math problems when the person who was recording his answers knew when the answer was correct. So, right, Hans was clapping out the number of times that it would require to get to the answer of the math problem. Imagine you, the observer, you notice that he's, the horse, getting closer and closer to the correct response. You might unconsciously start to get tense. You might unconsciously start to light up. You might unconsciously start to give a signal to the horse that he was getting close to the answer. To make sure that Hans was actually a math genius and wasn't just taking advantage of his ability to sort of be trained or conditioned to stop whenever the observer seemed to give him a signal that he was close to the answer, they actually tested Hans's math ability in a condition where the experimenter knew the correct answer or where the experimenter didn't know the correct answer. Right? So the experimenter, when they don't know the correct answer, they're given the math problem and they're told to collect the answer from Hans. But they didn't actually know the answer until after the fact. In the condition where the experimenter who was collecting data from Hans didn't know the answer to the math problem and just waited for Hans to indicate that his answer was complete, Hans actually only got the math problem right 8% of the time. So definitely within the realm of sort of random chance. But if the experimenter knew the answer, Hans got it right almost all of the time. So clearly this was not a horse that could actually do math problems per se. This was a horse that was able to pick up on signals from the observer. This is the classic example of how observer effects can be really, really powerful. Observer effects shaped the way these people wanted to see the data, and it changed their interpretation. Once you eliminate the observer effects from this phenomenon, you can see that we're basically left with nothing. We're left with just a slightly intuitive horse. Another famous example of a study that indicated the power of observer effects was Rosenthal and Fode's study on quote-unquote maze bright and maze dull rats. So the researchers asked their students to teach a sample of mice a simple T maze, the sort of maze that rats and mice are pretty able to pick up on through a few rounds of training. Rosenthal told some of his students that some of their mice were quote unquote dull, meaning that they were not so smart, and that others were smart, quote unquote bright mazes. So Rosenthal fully informed his students which of the mice were dull and which of the mice were smart or bright. The students then completed the training, recorded the data, and found that the smart mice learned the maze faster. Now, what the students or the RAs didn't know was that both groups of mice were exactly identical. This is an example of a slight use of deception in a survey. All right, the students in this case didn't know that it wasn't the actual maze or the mice's performance that was the critical variable being studied, but rather it was how the research assistants interpreted the mice that were quote unquote dull or smart. So the mice were all the same, but they were randomly assigned to either be considered the dull mice or the smart mice. The research assistants found that the mice that they considered smart did in fact learn the maze faster. But this wasn't due to anything about the mice themselves. Again, the mice were exactly the same. Clearly, something in how the students were reacting to the mice, something in how they treated them, something in how they trained the mice shaped how fast the mice actually completed the maze. So, the expectations of who's smart and who's dumb can really shape the way someone who's teaching might interact with that student, which in turn can really impact performance. Whenever I think about this finding, it always really makes me think about education in the United States. Any of you are from the United States, you know how in elementary school they put us all in dumb and smart math classes? I know you all know what I'm talking about. I don't know about you guys, but did that really shape how you felt about yourself? I know for me that definitely was the case. But here's the real question. Does the assignment of smart math and dumb math change the way your teachers respond to you? Do your teachers treat you differently if they think you're smart or if they think you're not so smart? Then, even more disturbingly, does a teacher's expectations that you're one or the other actually end up shaping their instruction in such a way that it can actually change your performance? I think about that a lot. I really think that sort of classing people into smart or dumb groups so early on not only shapes our self concept and how we think about ourselves in detrimental ways, it probably also shapes the way our teachers teach us in ways that might not be so beneficial to our performance. That's why when you come to my stats class, I always make sure to say that, in my opinion, which is backed up by the research, there's no such thing as someone who can't do math. You're maybe just someone who was told you couldn't do math, but the research really backs up my firm belief that that is absolute bullshit. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. I'm telling you here and now. It's bullshit. All right, moving on to the next internal validity threat, your demand characteristics. Now, this is something that more has to do with how your participants are behaving, more so than how your research assistants or the observers are behaving. So, demand characteristics have to do with the fact that participants who know what you're expecting from them, they believe that there's some sort of demand on how they're supposed to perform. Those expectations of how they're supposed to perform shape the way that they behave in the study, sometimes intentionally, but sometimes completely unconsciously. So, if participants change their behavior based on their conforming to what they believe the experiment is asking of them, that would be a major threat to internal validity. So, this is a concern whenever you have an experiment where you think participants are able to accurately guess the purpose of the study. The concern always becomes if they know your prediction, they can change your behavior in line with those expectations. Maybe participants guess the purpose of the study, they sort of figure out that they're in the experimental group, and they think that they can maybe sort of change or fudge their answers to sort of give you what you want. That's definitely a concern. You don't want the results of your experiment to be because participants were giving you what you want. Conversely, maybe you have a participant who guesses the purpose of the study and they intentionally want to throw a wrench in the works. They sort of answer in the opposite way. You don't like that either. Either one of those possibilities of demand characteristics is problematic because it is a detriment to the experimental validity. Any effects that are not due to the experiment itself, but rather due to what participants are trying to give you, is a detriment to your ability to make conclusions. So, ways that we try and make sure that demand characteristics don't enter into our conclusions is to somewhat shield the purpose of the study. So, any cover story where you tell participants something that's a little bit different from the true purpose of the survey, use of confederates or actors within the context of the study, or any slight uses of deception. So, any of these strategies are ways to reduce the effect of demand characteristics. Obviously, there's some ethical concerns with any of these. In the context of psychology research, we feel like the use of these strategies is at times justified, but they can only be used sort of in limited doses and only when strictly necessary. So, a cover story is going to be the apparent reason for the study given to participants. So, anytime I tell you guys when you're programming your survey that your consent form should maybe be a little bit more vague than the study truly is, right? Your study is on social media and self esteem. I tell you that your consent form should really say the relationship between behavior and emotion, right? It's not untrue, it's just more of a cover story. So, the apparent reason you give your participants for the purpose of the study that's meant to somewhat shield them from knowing the full true purpose might be termed a cover story. A Confederate might be an important part of your cover story. So, a Confederate is going to be anytime a member of your research staff is posing as another real participant, but really they're meant to surreptitiously be part of the experimental paradigm. There's lots of examples of really cool Confederates being used in psychology research. I'll just give you one example that I know is a really, really interesting paper. One study that was interested on the impact of insult on aggression really cleverly used Confederates to accomplish this. If you sit participants down and you say, I'm going to insult you and see what happens, the effect of that insult is probably going to be pretty moot, right? If somebody tells you they're about to insult you, but you know that they don't mean it, it's not going to have its intended effect. Insult is insult because you believe it's a genuine slight. So, how did the researchers seek to prime insult in their participants? Well, they trained a research assistant as a Confederate to pass through a hallway with the participants. Right, participants are told a cover story that the second part of the study is going to be down the hallway, and they just need to take their papers and walk down the hallway. While they're walking down that hallway, the Confederate intentionally shoulder checks the participant and calls them an asshole. Then, once the participants arrive to the next room, that's when they're assessed for levels of aggression. So they ostensibly just thought that this random person called them an asshole, insulted them for no reason. The control participants merely walked down a hallway past this Confederate without being shoulder checked or insulted. So the idea is, can you see higher levels of aggression in those participants who were insulted? Again, if insult is the IV, it needs to feel natural. So this particular study really couldn't have occurred without that use of a cover story and a Confederate. So some manner of deception is at times used and at times necessary over the course of some research, particularly in some aspects of social psychology where we're studying these really subtle effects of human behavior and thought and emotion. At times, we really can't get a natural response from participants and see naturally occurring effects if we're really giving up the ghost and telling participants every little detail of the study. So at times, we need to use some limited deception. So deception is any manner of lying to participants about some aspect of the experiment. Now, obviously, lying in and of itself is wrong. To deceive people is wrong. We like to, in the context of psychology, say that there's some justified use of deception if it's really, really necessary to the purpose of the study. But we really do deploy deception thoughtfully. We think about what kind of deception is used and when it's appropriate. So some deception that might be used in a psychology experiment is going to be a lie of commission, a sort of a more active deception. So this is when you actually volunteer something to participants that is inaccurate, that is a lie. So a cover story, that's a lie. A Confederate, that is a lie. This is when you, the researcher, are sort of putting out there some deception. This obviously is a bit ethically dubious, and we can't do this willy-nilly in our research. We can't just deceive participants because we think it's funny or because we think we can get away with it. There's really a well fleshed out ethics of the use of deception in psychology research. Typically, a lie of omission is thought to be better than a lie of commission. So as I mentioned, for your guys' research, your consent form, I typically tell you to give a description of the survey that's just a little bit more vague, right? You tell participants that the experiment is about attitudes and behavior, and that's not wrong. It's just a little bit more vague. You're not giving them all the information. So that's more a lie of omission. You're not including everything. So you're not actively committing an act of deception. You're sort of leaving something out. So typically, when we're debating the ethics of deception, we think that omission is a little bit more okay to use a bit more liberally. A lie of commission, where you say something actively inaccurate to your participants, this is obviously a lot more ethically problematic, and we can't do this for no reason. Any IRB proposal that indicates a lie of commission and use of deception that actually misleads participants, the IRB is going to do a much more stringent review of the ethical implications of that survey. They're going to really nitpick the usage of that commission. They're going to make sure that it's justified, and they're going to try and ask you to find any alternatives. If there really is no alternative, the IRB might allow it to go ahead. For example, that classic study on the impact of insult on aggression, there's really no way to study the effect of insult unless you're sort of misleading participants a little bit. Like I mentioned, insult is only insult if it feels like it's naturally occurring. So the IRB is definitely going to look very closely at any designs that use deception, particularly lies of commission, but it doesn't mean that it's not ultimately going to be approved. If you do use any deception whatsoever, participants need to be fully debriefed upon the study's conclusion. So a debrief is an after the study roundup of what exactly the survey was about. An in-depth explanation of everything that participants went through and why. So if you had a Confederate or if you used any sort of deceptive cover story, you need to fully apprise of participants of that once the study is concluded. So there's some study designs that are particularly used to try and limit any of these threats to internal validity. So one is going to be your basic single blind design. So anytime group assignment is hidden from participants to limit the demand characteristics, this is what we call a single blind design. Single blind because participants and participants only are going to be unaware of which condition they were in. So if participants are unaware of the assignment of conditions, they're unaware of the variables that are being assessed and the true purpose of the study, largely through lies of omission, this would qualify as a single blind design that specifically is effective for reducing the demand characteristics that your participants might display. If you want to limit both demand characteristics and observer effects, right, demand characteristics are typically going to come from your participants and observer effects are going to come from your research assistants. Double blind is meant to reduce both. So double blind is when both the participants and the experimenters collecting the data are unaware of the group assignment. So obviously there needs to be a principal investigator that knows the group assignments. They and they alone should be aware of which participants are in which group, but the research assistants who are collecting the data should not be aware. So double blind means both the research assistants and the participants are unaware of the group assignment and to a certain extent the overall specific predictions being made. The most rigorous study in the context of limiting a lot of these threats to internal validity is where we try to limit demand characteristics, observer effects, and placebo effects is going to be your double-blind placebo-controlled study. So this is the most rigorous kind of experimentation that can be done, where both research assistants and participants are unaware of which condition they're in, and there is a placebo or control condition. Particularly for medical research to try and develop new treatments, this is really going to be the best standard for determining whether or not a treatment is effective. So when we're trying to develop new medications, new vaccines, it is really important that we go through this rigorous testing. If we're administering a medication or a treatment to people, we really want to know that the treatment itself is effective and it's not due to participant expectations, experimenter expectations, or placebo effects. You guys probably know the ongoing debate on the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in the treatment of coronavirus. Now, initially, there was one study that came out indicating that hydroxychloroquine might be effective. It's an antiviral treatment for malaria. So the idea was it's an antiviral, maybe it works for the coronavirus. The one study came out and everyone kind of got excited. Well, a deeper dive into that one study that came out of France on the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine was not a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. So subsequent experiments on hydroxychloroquine as a treatment have actually found, if anything, a mild benefit. And really, there's more and more research coming out in the previous weeks indicating that actually there might be a detrimental effect. There might be some side effects of hydroxychloroquine on the heart and other internal systems that actually overall counteract any potential benefit as an antiviral that might actually make hydroxychloroquine as a treatment not only not beneficial, but actively harmful. So this is why it's really important to use this gold standard experimental paradigm for potentially widely used treatments, right? Everyone got excited because of hydroxychloroquine. People were trying to get their hands on it even without a prescription. People took it. There were people who were harmed by taking it without getting it prescribed by a doctor. It's really important to wait for the results of a double-blind, placebo-controlled study before we jump the gun and assume a treatment is effective, because the consequences of touting a treatment that's not actually effective can be quite dire. So now I'm just going to go through a few hypothetical examples of some potential confounds and the specific solution for the hypothetical research design flaw. So overall, confounds are all about trying to think through failures of internal validity from your experimental design. So overall, when you're thinking about confounds, this is about trying to think about any way in which your experimental group and your control groups were similar in ways that you don't want them to be, or different in ways that you don't want them to be. Again, experiments are all about trying to isolate the effect of your IV on the DV. Any other factors that get in the way could be seen as a confound and a detriment to your experimental efficacy. So your first example, let's say I'm interested in the effect of public speaking on confidence. Let's say I, because I'm a bad researcher, let my participants choose which condition they'd like to be in. I say there's going to be a public speaking condition and there's going to be a non-public speaking condition. If you'd like to give a speech in front of an audience, be in the public speaking condition. I collect the data, I do a t-test, participants in the public speaking condition had higher levels of confidence. I therein conclude that public speaking made people more confident. No, that is garbage. You might be thinking to yourself, wouldn't people who opt into a public speaking condition naturally be more confident? Well, yeah, no shit. I messed up by not randomly assigning participants to one condition or the other. Failure to random assignment can definitely be a detriment to isolating the effect of your IV on a DV. So if people are selecting into conditions non-randomly, your selection effects, you are letting those selection effects get in the way of identifying any true effect of the independent variable. So don't do that. Don't let participants pick which condition they'll be in. Just randomly assign them and bypass selection effects. Okay, let's say I'm investigating a new treatment for depression and I give some participants a medication and I say, hey, look, you're getting this experimental treatment for depression. It's a new SSRI, it's whatever it is. And then the placebo group, I say, hey, you're getting a sugar pill. You're not getting active treatment. Participants in the medication group then report better outcomes after the course of the survey, and I conclude that my medication improved depression. Well, no, again, that's garbage. People who know they're receiving active treatment might have more optimism. They might have a higher expectation for improvement, and this might in turn shape their perceptions and their behaviors. Maybe the participants in the medication group didn't improve because of my medication, but just because I led them to believe they were getting active treatment. I don't want to see improvement because of their beliefs. I want an actual effective treatment. So, in order to actually identify the effect of the medication versus the belief about receiving treatment, I need to institute blind design. Whether it's a single blind or double blind, right? I want to reduce the effect of knowledge of the condition to impact the results that I get. So then lastly, let's say I'm doing a cognitive research study where I want to know whether or not mnemonic, right, like using um, like letter cues to try and remember things, or a color coding memory training task to improve performance on memory. Let's say I decide to institute a within subjects design because I know those are very common in cognitive research. I have my participants do the mnemonic training first. They take the memory task once. They do the color coding training. They take the memory task again. Participants then did the best after color coding. I conclude, based on a repeated measures t-test, that participants get the most memory benefit from a color coding training. Well, no, I cannot conclude based on that garbage that the color coding was better. So I have a couple options for improving this particularly flawed design. I can either counterbalance my conditions. This is a way to make sure that order effects don't enter into your within subjects design. I would randomly assign participants to either have mnemonic training first or color coding first, thereby allowing me to see whether or not participants improved more from mnemonic or color coding beyond simple order effects, training effects, or fatigue effects. So in the within subjects design, I can't randomly assign to conditions because participants are all going to see every level of the independent variable. But I can randomly assign them to a specific order of the conditions. And that's what I would need to do to make this within subjects design usable. Another option is to just go between subjects. That eliminates the potential for order effects because participants are only taking one level of the independent variable. So for any experimental confound, there should be a way to either take into account the potential confound or to try and design a better experiment to reduce or eliminate its effect. So that'll do it for this talk on experimental validity.